Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of So Simple with Miss Sarah. Today I'm going to show you guys how to make these really cute Valentine's owls. It's really simple and all you need are a few basic supplies, which we'll go over right now. I'll put him back here. So one of the things you're going to need is a sewing template so that you can make that shape. This is always going to be available in the video description, so on any of my So Simple episodes, just check the description and I'll have the sewing template with a link that you can print. And when you print it out, just make sure you print it as actual size so the sizing doesn't get distorted. All right, you are also going to need some felt. This is just one color, but you can use multiple colors on your owl. So my previous example, I used pinks, but I think on this one, I'll make a purple owl. You are also going to need some embroidery thread. You might want multiple colors depending on what you decide to stitch on and what you decide to glue on. You will need a pair of scissors, something to mark up your pattern to make it easier to cut out. So in this case, I use a disappearing ink marker, but a pencil would work fine too. You will also need an embroidery needle. So an embroidery needle has a very large eye, and that's just so that you can thread the thicker embroidery thread through it. So you'll need an embroidery needle. And then optionally, you might also want to use a pin just to help hold things together while you sew. You can also use some fluff in this project. This fluff is called polyfill. You can get giant bags of it for very, very cheap. And lastly, if you decide to glue on some of your pieces, so for this project, we will at least glue the nose on, but you can glue more of your pieces on if that's what you decide to do. You will need some tacky glue. And I think I may have forgotten to mention this, but you will also need 2 buttons. So they're rather small buttons, but you can use bigger ones. I just found these 2 tiny buttons, and they're going to work to hold the wings on. All right, so we're going to get started. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my template I showed you. I'm going to cut this all out, and then I'm going to cut out my fabric pieces that I want to use. So I'm going to use purple for the body this time and pink for the accessories, but I'll stick with a red heart. So you go ahead, print out your template, cut out your pieces, and then we'll get started by looking at how to attach this first layer. So how to put on these eyes, the nose, the wings, and the heart, because we need to do all of that before we sew this together. So let's get started on that. So I went ahead, like I said, and I cut out all my pieces so they're all set and ready to go. So to begin, we need to just take one of the 2 body pieces we cut out. So our instructions said to cut 2, so we did, but for now we're going to set one of those pieces aside. We're going to use that later. And we're just going to work on the one that's going to be the front of our owl. So we need to attach its eyes, nose, and heart. So we can do that in any order. I think I'll start with the eyes though. So like I said, this is optional. So at this point, you do not have to sew any of these pieces on. If you think that's a little tricky because they're smaller pieces, you can take that tacky glue I mentioned earlier and you can just glue on all these details. But for the sake of the video, I'm going to show you how to sew them on. So for all the pieces, with the exception of the nose and the little black circles for the eyes, I'm going to sew them on. The eyes, black circles, and the nose, I'm going to use a glue just because those are extremely tiny pieces, so sewing those will be a little bit tricky, even for me. So to get started, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to thread our needle. So since I'm going to sew this pink for the eye, so the outer part of the eye, I'm going to use a pink thread. I don't really have an exact match to my pink, but I thought this was pretty close. So I'm going to take a little bit of my thread. It's probably a bit more than I actually need. I'm going to cut it free, put the rest aside, and then we're going to take our embroidery needle and just very carefully, you may need to wet the end of this a little bit just to get the fibers to stick together so the little strings don't fall apart. Sometimes just twisting it like that will work. Other times you just need to use your mouth and get it a little wet, or a little cup of water. Just make sure only one person puts it in their mouth if you decide to go the mouth route. So I'm going to have to do that. A little gross, but it works. All right, there you go. So you put that end through, and then you bring the 2 ends of your thread together. So if you put a lot of thread on your needle like I did, it might take a little effort. You can put your needle down at this point, and you're going to try to match these 2 ends up until you get them even. Okay, just like that. And then once you have your two ends even, so they're about even length, you're going to tie a knot. So you can pick everything up so that your needle falls in the center and you have your two ends. So to tie a knot, you can do it whatever way you feel comfortable. One way I like to do it is just wrap it around my finger until I make a little loop. And then I just pull my two ends through the loop and pull it tight. And just keep pulling until everything's even. So I missed one end. There we go. And now I have a knot. I'm going to do it one more time just so I have a double knot, though I think one knot with embroidery thread is more than enough just because these are thicker threads, so the knot's already pretty big. If it was regular sewing thread, you definitely need to do two knots, but with embroidery thread, you can usually get away with one. All right, here we go. And now for this extra bit after that knot, you can take your scissors and just trim it. Just make sure you don't cut the knot, otherwise you'll have to thread the whole needle all over again. But now your needle's threaded and you're ready to stitch. So we're going to take this owl back and we're going to place this little pink piece or whatever color you chose where we think we want the eyes to go. I think that looks just about right. And now I'm going to take my pin. And you do not have to use a pin. This is optional to hold your pattern pieces in place. And I'm just going to hold it in place just like that. There we go. And the reason we're only working on one layer of the body instead of both layers right now is because after we finish sewing, we're going to see all these stitches on the back. And if we worked with both layers already sandwiched together, we wouldn't be able to hide that. But once we finish attaching all our pieces, we can take the second layer, sandwich it on top, and we don't have to see all those stitches. So it'll help make it look more finished. So to get started, choose any edge point on the eye piece and bring your needle up from the back so that it pokes through both purple and pink fabric. Bring your needle all the way through until you hit that knot and you can't go any farther. So when your knot is against the back of the purple fabric or whatever color body fabric you chose, you can't go any farther. That means you've done it. And now we're going to do a running stitch. So we're going to do a little bit ahead. So pick a spot just a little bit ahead of where your thread is sticking out. So in this case, I'll go right here. And this time coming from the front, push your needle through. And once again, pull your thread all the way until you can't pull any farther. At this point, just try not to be tempted to keep pulling until it warps and pulls too tight, because that can mess up your fabric and damage it. So just pull just enough until it's all the way through. And then once again, coming from the back, pick a spot, bring your needle up, always going a little bit ahead of that last stitch. Pull until you can't pull anymore, and continue. Now I'm on the front again, so my thread tail is sticking out of the front, so my needle needs to go through the front. I pick a spot a little ways ahead, poke my needle through, and pull. Just like that. And I'm going to keep going. So now my thread's sticking out of the back. Means my needle needs to come up from the back. I'll pick a spot a little ahead, put my needle through, and pull until I can't pull anymore. And I'm going to continue this running stitch all the way around until I get to the back to this original stitch. I don't want to overlap it, but so just until I get about here with my last stitch. All right, so you keep trying to, keep practicing, do your running stitch and attach this part of the eyes. So I've made it all the way around my little outer part of my eye. So you can see on the back, you can see all those stitches now. So what we need to do is we need to tie those stitches off so we can cut our thread free from our needle. In this case, I'm going to cut a little lower because I don't need all this extra string just to tie a knot. Okay. And then just tie a basic knot. If your thread's a little twisted, you can untwist it too, just so your knot's a little closer to the fabric. Just be careful when you're tying your knots not to tighten it too much, just because it might make all the fabric try to like squeeze in on itself. So just tighten it enough so that the threads won't unravel. Go, and you can cut off any extra after the knot, so you don't need all those extra threads. All right, so our first part of our owl is done. So now we need to attach the next part. So moving around the eyes, we'll just keep building up. the next piece it needs to have is the white of its eyes. Now all my pieces are stuck together. There we go. So I'm going to put those so that they're relatively close together, so almost like they touch. I kind of want them to touch a little bit. You can do them farther apart if you want it to be like that, or you can do it like I'm doing and put them closer together. It's your owl, so you can do whatever you'd like. And you also don't have to make this a Valentine's themed owl. You can make whatever kind of owl. You can choose more realistic colors of thread. You can even try to make the Harry Potter owl. You can try to make Hedwig. That might be fun. So we're going to repeat the same exact process. So I'm going to fast forward through this part so you don't have to watch me do this all over again, because it's going to be the same exact process that we did to put this pink part on. We're going to thread our needle so it's all ready to go. This time I'll use white thread to match the white part of the eye. And then we're going to do the running stitch just around the edge of our circles. This time just make sure you get to the edge of the individual circles. Don't try to combine them as to one big circle like we did here, because these were already connected, but these pieces are not. So even though they're close together, they still need to be threaded and stitched all the way around both circles. Okay? If you needed a little bit more help with the running stitch, just watch that beginning part one more time, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stitch on those white circles. Just something to note, instead of trying to make my thread last across both circles, I started it again and I rethreaded my needle for the second circle, just to make sure that they're both secure and they're not relying on the same thread to hold them on. So if you've been enjoying these projects and you want to continue sewing, make sure to check out some of the library's books on sewing. We'll be happy to pull some for you, just like the 2 books I have behind me. They're great resources for beginners to learn to sew, as well as some of our digital books on Hoopla. They have great projects that are super easy to follow along to. And just like that, we have our white circles sewn on. So now we've sewn on all the pieces for the eyes that we can. And for this next bit, we're going to need to use some glue. So you can use tacky glue, like I mentioned before. If you don't have tacky glue, if you have fabric glue, that would work. Or if you have liquid Elmer's glue, that can work as well. Essentially any sort of liquid glue. So I want this owl to be paired for my pink one, so I want the eyes to look in the opposite direction so that they can look towards each other. So this time I think I'm going to glue my 2 black circles on so they face that way so that they can look. So I'm going to go ahead, flip one over, just apply a little drop of glue, not too much, you don't need too much glue, just enough to get it to stick, and then push it down with nice firm pressure, and there you go. And then repeat the process. Go, last little drop for the nose, and then push and glue that on. Just know that once you have placed your items on, that's pretty much permanent, because the glue will leave a mark on the felt if you try to lift it and put it in a new spot. So make sure you're satisfied with where you want to glue your pieces before you glue them on. So now my 2 owls will look towards each other, which I think is really cute. They'll be a cute pair. All right, and the tacky glue will take some time to dry, so it probably won't be fully adhered for at least 24 hours. So for the rest of the project, it's possible that these pieces could fall off, so you could save the gluing till the very end, but as long as you're careful, they should remain on. All right, so we have a few more pieces to attach to the front of our owl before we can bring in the back piece. We need to give it a little heart for its belly, and we need to give it some wings. So the wings will introduce a new technique. We're going to use buttons to attach the wings, but for the heart, we're going to do the same thing we did for the eyes. So once again, I'm going to do a running stitch all along the outside edge of the heart. Pick a spot on your owl's belly where you would like it to be, and prepare your needle and do a running stitch along the edge, just like we did at the beginning. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to prep that, sew that on, and then we'll come back together and I'll show you how to do the wings. So I went ahead and I sewed on the heart off camera. Like I said, you sew it on just exactly the same as you've done the beginning parts. So just like the eyes, doing a running stitch along the outer edge. And now you have a cute little heart belly. This next bit is going to be a little bit different though. So to attach the wings, we're not going to do a running stitch along the edges. Instead, we're going to use a button to hold them on. So you can place them approximately where you want them. And then you will need at least 2 buttons. So your buttons may have, and it's a little tough to see, 4 holes or 2 holes. It's not too difficult to do a 4-hole button versus a 2-hole button. So in this case, I'll show you the 4 holes. If you're doing a 2-hole button, it's much all you'll do is go across those 2 holes a few times, but with a 4-hole button, you're kind of making an X shape on the inside. So we'll go a little bit closer to show you how to do that. So go ahead and get your needle threaded. Choose whatever color you'd like to use to attach your button, so whatever thread you want. For the sake of this, since my button's purple, I think I'll go with a purple thread. So let me get my needle prepped, and then we'll look a little closer on how to do this. I zoomed in just a little bit more, so hopefully you can see this okay. I know my finger has to hold the button on for the beginning bit, so it will be in the way a little bit. But what we're going to do our button is we're going to start from the back. So you can actually put your button down for a second. Position your wing where you want it approximately. You think that looks okay? And just to get started, we're going to bring our needle up from the back, right about where the center of our button would go. And then you're going to take your button, choose one of the holes, and kind of slide it through your needle. Now you can continue bringing your needle all the way through. It might get a little tight if your button's small like mine, but just make sure it fits ahead of time. You don't want to pick a button that's too small for your needle because it'll be impossible to sew with. All right, so now you can see the thread is sticking out of one hole of the button. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to whatever hole is diagonally across from where our thread is sticking out. So my thread is right here, so the hole that is diagonally across from it is this bottom left hole. And this could change if my button rotates, but right now it's the bottom left hole, so we're going to pick that one. And since my thread is sticking out of the front, we're going to go from the front, and we're going to stick the needle through that hole and bring it now all the way out until it can't pull any farther. Perfect. So at this point now, we have 2 options, so we can either pick the bottom hole or the top hole. Our button's kind of stuck in place at this point, so we're going to have to poke through a few times and try to poke through one of those holes. And that can be a little tricky, but don't give up. Once you've got it through, you can pull the needle through all the way, just like that. And now your needle only has one other hole to go through, and that is the top button that we didn't sew through before. And essentially what we're doing is we're making a little X with our thread. And because this button is so darn tiny, you only need to do this process once. If you're using a much larger button, you may want to repeat that and do it a second time. But like I said, these buttons are extremely tiny, so only once through is enough. And then you can flip it over, cut away this loose thread, and tie a knot to hold it on permanently. And then repeat the same process on the other side of your owl, trying to match up the heights of your wings, and attach the button one more time on this side with your second button. It's not too difficult to do this. You can go back, watch this step one more time, and like I said, if you're doing a 2-hole button, which is what I did on this owl, you really are only going through the 2 holes and going across. And in that case, you may want to do it a second time. So just go from the back through that first hole, bring it from the front through the second hole, and repeat, going from the back through this hole and through the front on that hole, and then tie it off. Not too hard. If you'd like another look at how to do a button, I will link in the description below another video where I go in a little bit more detail on how to attach buttons. But for now, I'm going to tie off this thread, and I'm going to repeat that process and attach my other wing. So I went ahead and I attached my second button, and you might notice already that my 2 buttons don't exactly look alike because I didn't take my own advice and make sure my needle fit through my button. I just assumed they were the same, and it turns out they were not. My second button was actually too small for my needle to fit through, and they were actually 2 different buttons. But luckily, I found in my little button bag a square button that had big enough holes that was similar in color, and I actually kind of think the square and circle buttons look kind of cute together. So I'm happy with it, but make sure you don't do what I do in that regard, and you check your buttons, both buttons, before you try to attach them. All right, with that aside though, we are finally ready to attach the back, so now we can hide all this messiness. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take our back piece and you're going to line it up against your front piece as best as you can. It might be a little uneven just because, you know, we're human and we cut things out by hand. And if you have a pin, you can pin these pieces together, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to thread a needle. And you might want to use a color that's similar to the outside color, or you could pick a contrasting color. In my case, this is the only purple thread I have, so it's considerably darker than the owl base I've used, but I think the dark color will look cool on the edge. So I'm going to go ahead, prep my needle, and then I'll walk you through how we're going to sew this part together. So I used my pin just to hold the pieces together. And what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing we've done already. We're going to do our running stitch. So we're going to keep practicing that running stitch. And this time, though, we're going to go along the outer edge of our owl's body. But with one exception, we do not want to close the owl up. We want to leave a spot. I'm going to leave a spot under the wing just in case it looks a little funky afterwards, because we do want to take that massive pile of fluff I told you to have earlier, and we want to stuff our owl so he can become a cute little plushie. So to get started, I'll show you again one more time how to do that running stitch. Make sure your 2 layers are together so that all your threads from earlier are now hidden. I'm going to start near the wing, but I'm going to use this spot later when I get all the way back around to fill it with the stuffing, so I'm not going to start underneath there, but just right above it. Bring my needle up from the back, so now it's sticking through both layers of fabric, and pull until I reach the knot at the end of my thread, and I cannot pull any farther. And now that my thread is sticking out at the front, I'll pick a spot a little bit ahead. Once again, making sure I got through both layers of fabric, and repeat. And just pull my thread now until it gets all the way to the edge of the owl. And now a little bit ahead again. Poke your needle up. And keep pulling. If your thread gets a little tangled, just take your time. There's no rush. Guide it through slowly. If you go too fast, it might try to tangle on itself. And say you didn't prep enough thread and you're making your way around your owl, you're going to stop what you're doing. You're going to tie off your thread when you can't go any farther. And then you'll start again from wherever that point was. So just stop, tie off your thread, re-prepare a new needle with more thread, and continue from that point. So don't worry, it's not the end of the world if you didn't prep enough thread, or if a knot formed and you have to cut it off and start again. You can save what you did basically just by tying a knot. It will save your work and continue from that point. All right? So one more time, my thread is sticking out of the front of my fabric, which means my needle needs to come from the front. So I'll bring it through both layers of fabric and pull completely until I get it all through. If I got any little extras, throw those away. And do your best to line up your edges while you're working. And if after you've made it all the way around you notice there's a lot of overlap, you can just take your scissors and trim once you're finished. So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to go sew all the way around my owl, and I want you guys to try to do the same. When you do go past the wings, just make sure you sew under the wings and not over them. You just kind of push them out of the way while you work through this area. You don't want to accidentally sew them in. So I've made it almost all the way around my owl at this point, and I have a little bit of a hole right here under the wing. So I'm going to remove my pin and set that aside in a safe place. And I'm going to bring out my stuffing. This is probably more than I will use, but it's just a big pile of stuff. And we're going to break that up, and you're going to just kind of leave the thread and the needle still attached to your owl. Just make sure the needle's aside so you don't accidentally poke yourself, because it can be really sharp. And taking small bits at a time, using that hole you left, start filling up your owl. And you may need to use a marker or the eraser end of a pencil just to help push it all in there. Nothing with a sharp point. Usually what I'll do is I'll start with the ears. So I'll take my marker and I'll kind of push all that fluff up into the ear. It can be a little tricky, so you may want an adult's help at this point. And like I said, remember, some of your pieces might be glued on, like your eyes and your nose. And if you haven't given them the full 24 hours to dry, which I did not, because I wanted to show you how to make this, they could potentially fall off at this stage. So if that's the case, don't panic, it's okay. You can just glue them right back on. So go ahead, keep stuffing your owl. Do your best to fill in those ears so they get nice and fluffy. Beyond a certain point, they will not stuff, so do the best you can. And keep filling your owl until you're satisfied. Remember to make sure you keep pushing that needle away so you don't poke yourself. So I stuffed my owl, and as you can see, like I said, because the glue wasn't fully dry yet, my eye did pop off, so I'll glue that back on after the end. I just kind of set it aside over here. So now that I'm stuffed to satisfaction, what we're going to need to do is we're going to kind of pinch this together with our hands at this point. You can push the rest of the stuffing in, and we're going to finish sewing our running stitch along this edge. So if you forgot where to go, which direction, from the back or the front, just look at where your tail of your thread was sticking out. So mine is sticking out from the back of my owl. So that means I need to come from the back. So I'll push it up from the back, bring it all the way through, pull my wing aside so I don't sew through the wing on accident. And now from the front, push in and continue. And you're just going to keep going until you've made it all the way through your owl. And he might look a little awkward because you didn't stuff this part yet, so after you finish sewing him closed, usually I give him a good squish around, flatten all that fluff out, get it nice and even, and then you're good to go. So let's do that. So I've evened out my fluffing, and I re-glued on my eye, and this time I will give it the proper 24 hours to dry, and my owl's done! So the final prototype of the pattern ends up being a little bit of a chunkier owl, where my original is a little bit skinnier, but I think these two make an absolutely adorable pair. They're my little lovebirds. So I hope you guys have a lot of fun with this. I hope you try to make your own owls, and I hope you share what you've made. So please, please, please share if you tried these projects or any of our other sewing projects. You could share them on social media using the hashtag LRWLKids or LRWLTeens. You can also email us at the library if you have any pictures you'd like to share. We'd love to see them. I hope you guys have fun. Happy sewing. Bye-bye.